We have taken a look at the first 12 chapters. We've taken a look at Isaiah's introductory material that, as we've seen, already gives his message in miniature. It is a collection of oracles, and except for chapter 6 and chapter 7, they are undated. We don't know exactly where they came during Isaiah's ministry, so it is very, very hard to speak beyond chapter 6 and chapter 7 of the exact chronology. Obviously, chapter 8, as we said, with the far sign that was given concerning the Messiah, the guarantee for the house of David, that then in chapter 8, a near prophecy was given concerning Isaiah's second child, as far as children that are seen on the pages of Scripture. And before he would come to be a child, come into the ability to be weaned and make moral judgments, then for Ahaz and for that generation, the indication was given that the invasion would come in the land from Assyria and not from Israel and Aram, the alliance that Ahaz was fearing at that historical time. And then Isaiah branches through and says, all right, as the Assyrians come in and start to deal first with the north and then the south as they come in to desolate the land, they'll begin in chapter 9 in the tribal territories of Zebulun and Naphtali. And that's exactly where God is going to begin his work of salvation. That is where his light will first shine. And of course, that is picked up in Matthew chapter 4 as an indication of why Jesus begins his great public ministry of the validating miracles and prophetic word that he gives, why it starts in Galilee. It starts in this historic area that had been first taken over by the Assyrians, with the idea, of course, the light that would first shine there would then continue to extend until finally in Jerusalem, this Davidic king would rule and reign not only over Israel, but over all the nations as well. And so we see that within these chapters, as we saw in chapter 1, we see in chapters 2 to 4, we see in chapter 7, 1 through 9, 7, 9, 8 through the end of chapter 12, that Isaiah continues to broaden now from his present day and look to the coming judgments that God was going to bring on Judah, and in chapter 9 and 10 upon Israel, and how God was going to then bring judgment upon the judges that would then open out into to the redemption, the deliverance of the nation, which is when the branch, when the son, when the king, when the second Moses, with the second Exodus would come and establish his righteous, just rule from Jerusalem over the nation of Judah, Israel. And certainly chapter 2, as in chapter 9, 6 and 7, have implied that is going to go far beyond just Jerusalem to the nations as well. Then in chapters 13 to 27, after these oracles that have focused upon Jerusalem and Judea in particular, even though obviously because of what was going to take place, there's words about Israel and Assyria as well. We then move into the second section of this first major division of Isaiah. And now we have oracles of the nation's judgment and restoration. And what we have in chapters 13 through 23 is we have Isaiah's oracles against the nations. the nations that were in existence during his time period, including, and so we have a debate that has arisen. He begins with Babylon. And in fact, we'll actually come back to Babylon. It is the one nation that he speaks about twice, that in chapter 21 he talks about the oracle concerning the wilderness of the sea, the sandy wastes of the south country. And since in verse 9 he speaks about fallen is Babylon, he talks about the one who's going to come and lay siege, go up Elam, lay siege, Media, etc. He is looking ahead within even the oracle at the beginning of chapter 21 to what is going to take place in Babylon. So the nation that gets the double whammy within the oracles is Babylon, and it also begins in chapter 13 and chapter 14 through verse 27. And interestingly, at this point, Isaiah does not have a special oracle against Assyria. He's already given one in chapter 10. It is interesting when you get to chapter 14, you find that Assyria is joined with the oracle against Babylon. And so we see when we get to chapter 14, verses 24 to 27, as kind of a conclusion to what he says about Babylon. He also brings an oracle against Assyria and Assyria's coming judgment as well. So these are the oracles against the nations. And two things, and again, as I said previously, that we can't go through every verse and every chapter of Isaiah, but I do encourage you sometime as you work through Isaiah to take a look at the notes in the MacArthur Study Bible. There are excellent notes on Isaiah. But we want to take a look particularly at a couple of interpretive issues that arise dealing with this first oracle against Babylon. And then we'll come back and see that even as with Judah and Israel, where Isaiah has spoken about the future restoration after judgment, that we see the same thing as far as a number of these nations within the oracles as well. However, we come to chapter 13 and 14. You will note in chapter 13, verse 1, that Isaiah says that he is giving a burden, a judgment, concerning Babylon. And so this is a statement about Babylon and what God is going to do against Babylon. In chapter 14, verses 3 and 4, Isaiah is led to bring a taunt against the king of Babylon when God's judgment against Babylon comes to pass. So the 14:3, it will be in the day when the Lord gives you rest from your pain and turmoil and hard service in which you have been enslaved, that you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, right? So though it is revealed to Isaiah, and Isaiah says it, this is what is going to be the taunt taken up against the king of Babylon when Israel has rest. And going back to chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, this certainly seems to be looking ahead to the final rest that will take place. that this king of Babylon that will be taunted is, as it were, the final king of Babylon who will experience God's judgment in the future. Now, as you can see by the names that I have added to your notes, you will see that there is a great deal of debate on exactly how we are to understand Babylon in chapter 13, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 2. And when we get down to chapter 14 and the taunt against the king of Babylon, there's more unanimity about who the king of Babylon is. But what is the antecedents of this king? And immediately we are cast into the hermeneutical dilemma that we have as we read Isaiah and we read the other prophets as well. For as we think in terms of the prophet, right, here he is, and here's his eyes, and he is looking out. And before him, as it were, are mountain peaks. The peak of what is going to take place in the coming days of his own life. We could talk about as far as the immediate future is concerned, that which will, take place in just the next few generations. You can then look ahead to what we now know from the New Testament is events associated with the first coming of Jesus Christ. And of course, you can also look ahead, and now with our New Testament understanding, also speak of events that relate to the second coming of Christ as well. And yet, as his gaze, as he looks at these events, and the greatest illustration I can think of is, and I know most of you don't live in California, but hopefully sometime while you're here in seminary, you will take a trip up 395 between here and, don't go to Reno, just drive up 395. It's a wonderful, drive up the Owens Valley and then into the Sierra. And when you get to Carson City, take a left and go up to Tahoe, which isn't a whole lot, better as far as, the culture than Reno, because there's all kinds of gambling sites there as well. But at least it's in beautiful scenery. The lake is beautiful. And it has been a favorite spot for my family to go for vacations over the years. And you go through, it is Lone Pine, and you go to the Whitney Lookout Center, Mount Whitney. So you want to see the largest mountain, the highest mountain in the continuous 48 states. And you take a look, and it's almost impossible to figure out as you're looking, because you're looking at a distance, which one is Whitney. You can't tell which is the highest mountain. They all kind of blend together because you're looking and there are, mountains in front of and peaks beyond Whitney, and they all blend together as you are looking at them. You just kind of see it, and to the naked eye, it is such that a couple of the peaks that are closer actually look higher to you as you're looking than Whitney. That is literally the highest of the peaks. So every time I'm at Lone Pine, I think of the Old Testament prophets. I mean, probably I'm the only one who does, as I'm looking out at that point and saying, now this is just like interpreting the Old Testament prophets. That basically, and it is agreed upon by all conservative prophetic scholars who see the fact that Isaiah is speaking about the future. This is not something between a a dispensationalist and a covenantalist, because they also believe in, first and second coming of Christ as well. And everyone sees it. You get in the commentators and say, this is all blended together, what he's speaking about. And so there have been two basic approaches that have been taken, actually three basic approaches that have been taken. And that is that in Isaiah 13, Isaiah is either speaking about something that is in his day or is in the immediate future. And of course, that which is within his own day is the destruction of Assyria. What is going to be in the immediate future, in the next generation, is the fall of Babylon to the Assyrians in 689 BC. What is in a little further distant future is the Median invasion of Babylon that takes place in 539 BC. And for most, that this in some way anticipates what is going to take place in the far distant future. Because in verse 6 and again in verse 9 in chapter 13, Isaiah speaks about the day of the Lord. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. And verse 9, behold, the day of the Lord is coming. And in verse 10, he speaks about how, along as he's speaking with Babylon's judgment from the Lord, that the stars of heaven, their consolation, will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shed its light. And in light of other prophetic statements, this seems to be not something that would happen literally in Isaiah's day or the immediate future, but he is now looking to the ultimate destruction that is going to take place as far as the heavens and the earth is concerned, with the signs within the heavens, that at this point he is anticipating his vision that he sees of the judgment upon the nations in chapter 24, which in 24 to 27 is going to culminate this section on his oracles against the nations. So that the majority of interpreters, as you can see that in some way in chapter 13, the fall of Babylon in history, that is something close at hand, is also being used in some way to speak about the future eschatological judgment of Babylon as well. And you can see that the three major commentators that we have recommended for you all see in some way the fall of Babylon foreshadowing the future fall of Babylon in the eschatological time period. Now, Motir does, even though he sees this as foreshadowing, sees the near historical event as being the destruction of Assyria. His point, we've already brought this out, is that at this point, the king of Babylon was also the king of Assyria. And so he looks into that near history and says, all right, it's not Babylon as such, but it is Assyria. Assyria's rule during Isaiah's day that Isaiah speaks will come to an end, anticipating what is going to take place in the eschatological future. In the Bible Knowledge Commentary, Martin's work there says this is the fall of Babylon, but it is the fall of Babylon to Sennacherib and the Babylonians in 689 BC. We brought up that the Babylonians, in the period from 709 to 703, actually won their independence for a number of years from the Assyrians. And though the Assyrians go in and control them again, Sennacherib, that the Babylonians continue to ferment rebellion against Assyria, including seeking to make alliances with other nations. And by 689, Sennacherib had enough of it and just goes in and wipes the city out. Well, it's going to be rebuilt, but he just goes in and obliterates the city at that point. And Martin brings up that that is a better near judgment in Isaiah's day than 539 BC, because in 539 BC, the Medes, which is true, did not destroy Babylon at that time. They took Babylon over. And it was only in later centuries when slowly but surely Babylon deteriorated and became the broken down city underneath the sand that it became until restored by the archaeologists during the 19th century. But it didn't happen immediately, although obviously the decline of Babylon as a city began to take place in 539 BC. So Motir and the Bible Knowledge Commentary don't see this as the fall of Babylon foreshadowing the future fall. They see something of 539. They see something else, but all see in some way the fall of Babylon then, no matter how you interpret A, B, or C, foreshadowing what's going to take place in the distant future. Now, Oswald Young and Motir just take the standard evangelical approach, which is there's double meaning. The statements within the context can mean both. In other words, when they speak about what's going to take place, 13:10, with the stars of heaven, the sun will be dark, the moon will not shed its light, etc. When I punish the world for its evil, all right, that has a near fulfillment for Babylon historically. But what's going to take place symbolically at that time is literally going to take place when the Lord returns in the future. Now, this was brought up last year, and I have to admit that as you read cracking Old Testament codes, the weakest chapters in the book have to deal with the prophets. Now, it is true that broadly they give you some information, you've already seen it, that as you read the prophets, there are oracles of judgment and there's oracles of salvation. Now, I'm sure you've already figured that out from your scan of the prophets as you went through, and they go through and give you some of the exegetical elements that you should be aware of, that there tends to be some very definite language and grammatical structure that is used as you come to the different oracles of judgment and the oracles of deliverance, the oracles of salvation. In the prophets, interestingly, those chapters do not concentrate as much on Isaiah, though, as they do Jeremiah and Ezekiel, because when we get there, that Jeremiah and Ezekiel are a little more clear-cut on those aspects of here's judgment and here comes the deliverance that will come after the judgment. The prophet who most mixes up prophecy like a scrambled egg is Isaiah. Now, that my scrambled egg analogy is, of course, the fact that, all right, he stirs it all up and it comes together. Now, how do you find the yolk? How do you find the white? I mean, it's all together in a scrambled egg. And guess what? As the exegete, as the interpreter, you get to try to unscramble the egg in Isaiah. And so a number of students asked me last semester, well, all right, when it comes to Isaiah, is there a good basic hermeneutical text? In other words, can we go to a textbook, like a Zook that we use in biblical hermeneutics, that will say, all right, here's the basic principles you use of hermeneutics to apply to your exegesis of Isaiah and the other prophets. And I have to admit, I was stumped. I said, I don't know of any. And so I went to the master, Dr. Barrick, and said, do you know of any good book I can recommend to help students just have a basic, hermeneutical principles that are used to interpret the Old Testament prophets. And Dr. Barrick thought for a few minutes and said you could almost see him going through every book he has ever written as he kind of goes through them one at a time and says, I can't think of any. In fact, his recommendation was to get J. Barton Payne's work on the Encyclopedia of Bible Prophecy. And he was pre-mill, but post-trib. He's covenantal. It's a covenantal pre-mill. And said about the first 120 pages before he gets into the Bible prophecies, one by one themselves. He does try to enunciate what he has determined are the basic principles to apply in the study of biblical prophecy and particularly the Old Testament prophets. But I said, well, Payne was covenantal pre-mill, and I said, we certainly can't recommend that to the students as this is the law of the Medes and Persians, and everything he says is right. And he said, well, you're right on that. They'll have to read it with a certain amount of discernment as they go through it, but he thinks it's the best thing that's available. I've looked it over. You'll have to read it with discernment. But if some of you are looking for a THD thesis, now I know first-year students probably aren't thinking that far ahead, but there is certainly a great need for a good work on basic hermeneutical principles to be used in the exegesis of the Old Testament prophets. I have to admit that I take the basic and specific principles of your hermeneutics course, and knowing what we've just said, seek to at least exegetically be aware of the fact that we do have these different perspectives, and to read Isaiah as closely as possible and seek to say with any statement, what is he speaking about? Now, having said that, and knowing the way in which both covenantalists and dispensationalists really buy in today to double meaning, when you took hermeneutics, and I'm convinced of the single meaning of Scripture, that every sentence only has one meaning. Position D1 says that a statement can have a double or triple meaning. It can be a statement that first applies to something near at hand, something in the distant future or the immediate future, and then something in the far distant future, be it the first or second coming of Jesus Christ this side of the cross. Now, Isaiah, it seems at this point, has particularly within chapter 13, verses 2 through 16, he has looked ahead, and certainly all the way through verse 14, he has looked ahead. And again, it becomes a discussion on, all right, where does the far distant future come to an end, and does he get to the immediate future? Well, definitely when he gets to verse 17. He is no longer talking about the eschatological day of the Lord. For he says, behold, I'm going to stir up the Medes against them. Well, that would lead me to see the fall of Babylon in 539 BC as being the closer historical reference. I'm going to stir up the Medes against them. And their bows will mow down the young men. They will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor will their eye pity children. All right, so the Medes are going to come in and conquer the Babylonians. And notice at this point he speaks about the fact of putting Babylonians to death, not at this point, the destruction of the city itself. But in verse 19, in Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation, nor will the Arab pitch his tent there, etc. Now he is looking to the ultimate desolation of Babylon. And I would see him at this point, along with the note in the MacArthur Study Bible, he is leaping from 539 BC and the events that took there in verses 17 and 18. That's specifically what those verses refer to. And then he jumps ahead and speaks once again about the eschatological judgment that will take place, that will lead to the highway from Assyria, and the day when, chapter 13, that will look ahead to when the end of chapter 13, Babylon will be a complete desolation. And then in the beginning of chapter 14, he says, now this is the time when Israel is once again going to have compassion and be brought back to their place and possess as an inheritance in the land of the Lord, male and female servants, and they will take them as captives and will rule over their oppressors. The time when Israel will finally win its victory upon those who have oppressed them. So here's the problem. I don't think it's double meaning. I would say, just as within the MacArthur Bible study notes, blended yet distinct. And this is what makes Isaiah such a challenge. In one sentence, he's speaking about this, and the next sentence, he's speaking about something far distant. Actually, in chapter 13, begins with far distant and then comes to that which is going to take place in 539 and then jumps back into the far distant future. And it's not just here in chapter 13. This is Isaiah's modus operandi, as we've already seen in the first 12 chapters, that where he can literally within the same breath, and I'll be speaking about two different situations as he looks into the future. He's like the guy in Lone Pine taking a look at the Sierra and, just speaking about the four different peaks, but doesn't give you a clear, explicit statement on what he's speaking about when. You have to read and reread and actually then read it against previous prophecy, later prophecy, to start to come to this understanding. And so because of that, as you can see from the different commentaries, that what Isaiah is speaking, how Isaiah speaks about it, becomes matter of intensive interpretive discussion. So my position would be position D, the fall of Babylon, from C, 539 BC, with the Medes, foreshadowing the future fall of Babylon that is going to take place in the day of the Lord. Now what that means is that the ultimate desolation of Babylon is something not in the historical past. It is something in the eschatological events that still are to take place. And that gets into another big Pandora's box that I'm not going to open at this point. If you want to get the questions coming to me during the break, on whether Babylon is done forever as a city, it now just becomes symbolic in the New Testament, or whether when we take a look at the eschatological future, here in Isaiah, anticipating what we read in Revelation 17 and 18, whether there is going to be a future eschatological literal Babylon, which will be reestablished and judged during the eschatological events of the tribulation period and the return of Christ. I would lean toward the latter, but There is great debate even on our own faculty on that issue as well, on the future or non-future of literal Babylon. So this is the interpretive debate that takes place in chapter 13 and comes into chapter 14. And in chapter 14, we have another interpretive discussion that has arisen when Isaiah takes up the taunt against the king of Babylon. Again, I would see this as the eschatological king. And as you go through this, and there is pretty much universal agreement that verses 4 through 11 and verses 15 to 21 are dealing with the literal king of Babylon. The question comes again, whether by double meaning or blended yet distinct, that verses 12 to 14 look beyond the king to either the king as a type of Satan, or these are the words of Satan himself. How are you fallen from heaven, Hallel, shining one, son of the dawn? You have been cut down to earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heavens, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, I'll sit in the mount of the assembly. In the recesses of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I'll make myself like the Most High. And when we start to think in terms of literally being fallen from heaven, literally seeking to ascend into heaven, and to make oneself like the Most High, the church fathers very quickly read within that, and it became the predominant interpretation throughout the history of the Christian church, that this was a reference to none other than Satan. So much so that the Hebrew name translated into Latin Lucifer, became a name that was given to Satan himself. But everything before and everything after relates to this human king. And it's a taunt against this ultimate king of Babylon, though his heart is raised in pride against the Lord, is going to be cut down to size, if I can put it that way, within the future. And I have a sheet, we'll pass it out during the break, from Dorsey's work on the literary structure of the Old Testament that shows some very definite, and I think rightfully so, contrast between the king of Babylon in chapter 14 and the suffering servant of Isaiah chapter 49 to 57. And the fact that the suffering servant is going to be exactly the opposites of it. Now the EBC talks about the human king as a type of Satan, although there, and I would go along with Grogan, that, and this is a better way to see it, that in the eschatological future, the king of Babylon, if he anticipates, in other words, the king then that anticipates what's going to take place in the future, this is talking about this taunt against the ultimate king, that the ultimate king, if he is a type of anyone or looking forward to anyone, would not be Satan himself, but the one that Satan empowers in the future. In fact, this is the whole distinction in Isaiah, that the king of Babylon is a contrast to the suffering servant. It is Christ. And so if you're going to see any kind of a looking ahead here, it's not to Satan, it is to the Antichrist, who will have this attitude of seeking to establish his rule. And you can get into the commentaries. We won't take it through blow by blow, because as you can see, the major commentaries hold this position. And the fact that Isaiah is using terminology that was well known in his day. This is exactly how the human kings of Babylon spoke about the fact, using the religious language of the day, that as it were, they had literally gone to the mountain of God and had been crowned with that kind of glory. So here the best understanding is the fact that Isaiah is speaking about a human king only. Now you get into debate on who the human king is. And since he does speak about it in a far distant eschatological focus, upon obviously, and some of this language is picked up again when you get to Revelation 18, where you have a lament over Babylon because of its destruction that takes place in the eschatological future. But I would say A is the better position. And even if it is B, the human king, anticipatory or type of a future individual, it would be Antichrist, not Satan. And I don't believe that it is Satan only. Well, getting into the rest of the oracles, there isn't a whole lot of hope, obviously, that is given to Babylon here. But as you go through the different oracles, it is astounding as God speaks about how he is going to devastate and judge these other nations around him, basically because of their treachery, their lying, their butchery of other peoples as far as warfare is concerned, their arrogance, their pride, their fury, thinking they're going to get away with this and never bring into judgment. And so the basic sin of the nations is pride, arrogance, brutality, fury. The fact that they're of a lying tongue, they are braggarts and boasters. These are the basic sins that Isaiah identifies among these nations. But as you can see, as I put in that little bracket for you, it is interesting that as you go through these oracles that by and large, after Babylon, look at near historical events that God is going to bring upon these nations as far as judgment is concerned. Yet significantly, as you can see, he speaks about certain of the nations being blessed in the future. For instance, in chapter 16, verse 5, in the midst of his oracle concerning Moab, he says in verse 5, a throne will even be established in loving kindness, and a judge will sit on it in faithfulness in the tent of David. Moreover, he will seek justice and be prompt in righteousness. And the fact that the Moabites are in some way going to participate in this future establishment of David's throne in the future, when justice and righteousness will be established. Again in chapter 17, when he's talking concerning Damascus, the capital of the Arameans, he says in verse 7, in that day man will have regard for his Maker, and his eyes will look to the Holy One of Israel. That, all right, yes, judgment is going to come, and yet in that future day of judgments, even those in Damascus will have regard for Israel's God and view him as their creator. Chapter 18. as he is speaking about Cush, Ethiopia. In verse 7, at that time a gift of homage will be brought to the Lord of hosts from a people tall and smooth, even from a people feared far and wide, a powerful and oppressive nation whose land the rivers divide, the land of Cush, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, even the Mount of Zion. So here are promises of deliverance where Moabites and Arameans and Ethiopians are going to be brought under the Lord's rule, under David, and bring their gifts to the Lord in the land of Israel. But that is nothing compared to what we see in chapter 19, the oracle against Egypt. And he says in verse 18 of chapter 19, in that day 5 cities in the land of Egypt will be speaking the language of Canaan and swearing allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One will be called the city of destruction. In that day there will be an altar to Yahweh in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to Yahweh near its border. What he's saying here is there's going to be 5 specific cities in the future that are not going to speak Egyptian, but the language of Canaan. And of course, the people who now live in Canaan are Israelites. So Hebrew is going to be their language, swearing allegiance to the Lord of hosts. There's going to be an altar in the midst of the land, a pillar to the Lord. And it'll be a sign and witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. Thus, verse 21, the Lord will make himself known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. They will worship, and the Lord will strike them. An image going back to the plagues, yet now not striking them with plagues, but striking them with healing in verse 22, and they will return to the Lord. So in verse 23, in that day there'll be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. And the Assyrians will come into Egypt, the Egyptians into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. So now Isaiah looks ahead and says, all right, there is going to be a highway all the way from Assyria, northern Mesopotamia, and of course in that day, and we can anticipate in the future day, the highway that will come through what land? Israel, on its way to Egypt. And the Assyrian's going to go to Egypt, the Egyptian's going to go to Assyrian, and notice they're going to worship with each other. And who are they going to worship? Yahweh. In that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, blessed is Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, Israel, my inheritance. Now, put yourself in Israel's shoes, Judah's shoes, as they hear Isaiah saying this. Who throughout the Old Testament has been Yahweh's people? Israel. Who has been, as a nation, the work of his hands? Israel. Now those terms are used for Egypt and then Assyria. All right? In the same way, I brought you out of Egypt and you became my people, my special treasure. In the future, Egypt is going to come to me and be my people in the same way as Israel. And just as I talk about Israel being the work of my hands, Assyria will be. But notice, Israel is still the nation of inheritance. It is still the one who will receive the greater blessing from the Lord in the future. It is still, as it were, the Lord's special nation that will get the inheritance, not quite reward, but the bestowal from Yahweh. But a bestowal that will just not be consumed upon themselves, but will be spread to the other nations. And of course, this is why God had chosen Israel in the first place, to receive blessing from him, that they would be a conduit of that blessing to other nations. So much so that Egypt and Assyria can be spoken of with the same terminology that's been used previously of Israel.
How would someone who believes that the church is Israel interpret such a passage?
Well, as we, being the new Israel, we display and dispense God's blessings to the nations today. They will say this is a great, great commission passage.
But who would be the Egypt and Assyria?
Well, these are just standing for all of the Gentile nations. But what they would say at this point is, all right, you take a look at Israel, Judah of Isaiah's day, and what were the closest major Gentile nations. Now, of course, he's talking about some of the other minor nations here as well, with Moab and Cush and the Arameans, etc. But who were the two major powers? Well, Egypt and Assyria. And Judah, Jerusalem, finds themselves between the two. And what Isaiah is saying at this point is these two nations that are now hostile against one another and are seeking, for you to join with them in the future, they are going to join with you in the worship of Yahweh. Now, you got to realize our Mill brothers, all of this becomes symbolic, right? Israel today is symbolic of the church, and Assyria and Egypt are symbolic of the Gentiles who are closest to the church, that the church should reach out as a conduit of God's blessing.
It seems strange comparison. Wouldn't it be better that Egypt would become Israel, or that Assyria would become Jewish? But to maintain their separate identity from the church and yet be worshiping God seems...
Well, of course, I'm with you. I'm seeing distinction here as well. I'm not seeing this as something that's fulfilled in the church. I don't see the church as the new Israel. I see Isaiah speaking here about restored Israel that is going to be the conduit at the same time as Isaiah chapter 2, that is at the end of the days when Jerusalem is going to be established as the center of worship of Yahweh and the nations are going to stream. This is just filling in some of those details. Okay, during that day, there is going to be a highway between Egypt and Assyria, so that both Assyrians and Egyptians maintaining their identity, still being Gentiles, still worshiping as Egypt and Assyrians will join with Israel in worshiping Yahweh. And especially Yahweh is going to speak of them as he has spoken about Israel within the Old Testament. So yeah, I'm with you. I don't see how in the end, because there are still going to be Egyptians and Assyrians worshiping Yahweh, where if the church is the new Israel, they should lose that Gentile identity, according to 1 Corinthians 10:30, and become part of the church of God. It's Jew, Gentile, and the church of God. So, but once you start saying anything can be interpreted symbolically, your symbols can just increase as much as you need to make it fit whatever your interpretive scheme is. See, once you open the Pandora's box to this can be symbolic of that, well, you can start making anything symbolic of whatever you want to make it. So I think the best understanding is a premillennial understanding, but then my Almill friends would say that I'm biased because I'm presupposed to my position. Not that they're not. In other words, again, you've read the New Testament, you come to your basic understanding of what is the church's relationship to Israel within the New Testament, and whatever your decision is there, it's going to have great ramifications. You go back and read the Old Testament.
When it refers to like Assyria, is that like a geographical description, or do you think that is an identity of a people that will return to that area? And if we're kind of taking that symbolically in a sense, does that sometimes add confusion, or do covenantalists think that we're being inconsistent because we wouldn't say there's going to be a literal Assyria that's going to worship?
And they will say that. They'll say, okay, it's easy today because there's still Egypt with Egyptians there. But okay, you go to northern Iraq today, all right, and we know, well, there's Kurds there, there's, the different, well, I don't know all the ethnic groups that are there, but they would say, okay, where's the ancient Assyria? Okay, so you would see that as a geographic entity saying, all right, basically Mesopotamia, at least northern Mesopotamia, and Egypt are going to worship together. There's going to be this highway. They're going to have to come through Israel. Okay, but even you're going to make that symbolic, and we do. I mean, even when we think in terms of, where are the Moabites today? All right, now we don't have the problem with Cush, but and where are the Arameans today? All right, we'd have a hard time tracking it down, but I would say the same God who is able and still knows the distinction between the tribes of Israel that we don't know today. He can still know who is a part of the different tribes, even though that has been lost to contemporary Judaism. They know they're Jewish, but they have no idea what tribe they're a part of. Well, it's the same thing today, as far as Gentile nations are concerned as well. But in the same way that God knows the heritage of the tribes of Israel, I have no problem saying the same way God knows the heritage of Gentile nations today. So he can talk about a future for Moab. He can talk about a future for Cush. He can talk about a future for the Arameans, Damascus. I mean, God just knows more than we do. And in some way, in the future, he can reconstruct the nations just as he knows exactly and will reconstruct the tribes of Israel. So I'm not so quick to, as a premillennialist, say these are just symbolic representations. But in the end, if you ask me where are they today, I have to shrug and say the same thing. We'll just have to wait till we get there to see how God works all this out. But I'm not willing to just state, because I don't know where these people are today, that God doesn't know where they are today, any more than the analogy of the tribes. And then at the end in chapter 23, he talks about Tyre, the city of Tyre. And in 17 and 18, and it will come about at the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre. Then she will go back to her harlot's wages, will play the harlot with all the kingdoms, and her gain and her harlot's wages will be set apart to Yahweh. It will not be stored up or hoarded, but her gain will become sufficient food and choice attire for those who dwell in the presence of the Lord. Now, understand at this point, harlotry here is being used very definitely within chapter 23 as an image of Tyre's commercial relationships with the other nations. She is like a harlot, as it were, selling her wares, selling herself for the financial benefit that will accrue to herself. What Isaiah is saying here is, all right, judgment is going to come upon Tyre, and then sometime in the future, she is once again going to play the harlot with the kingdoms on the face of the earth. That is, once again, she is going to be a leader in trade as far as the nations of the earth is concerned. But now she's not going to take her profits unto herself. She's going to bring the profits in worship to Yahweh. And again, you ask, well, when, how? Well, we just have to leave it till future for the Lord to fill in the details there. And then that leads into chapters 24 to 27. Here, having spoken about the nations specifically, and even with Babylon looking toward the day of the Lord, and even beyond the day of the Lord in the statements of deliverance and restoration and blessing upon certain of the nations within the oracles, now Isaiah in chapter 24 speaks about how God is going to judge the nations And yet in chapter 25 and 26, he brings the two songs that Israel will sing at that time because of God's protection. And then in chapter 27, the fact that Israel will be delivered to enjoy God's blessing in the future. So Yahweh's judgment and yet ultimate restoration of the earth, again with Israel being protected during that day, being delivered, so that again she can be the first one among the nations of the earth as God brings about his deliverance. And he ends up in 27, 12 and 13, just after, as we've talked in chapter 19, it will come about in that day that the Lord will start his threshing from the flowing stream of the Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, and you will be gathered up one by one, O sons of Israel. It will come about also in that day that a great trumpet will be blown, and those who are perishing in the land of Assyria and were scattered in the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord in the holy mountain of Jerusalem. All right, so Israelites who find themselves in Assyria, find themselves in Egypt, will return. And yet, using that terminology again of Egypt and Assyria, is a reminder of, as this takes place, it is also going to be for the blessing of Egypt and Assyria as well. So Yahweh's judgment, but ultimate restoration of the earth. All right, let's go ahead and take our break at this point. And we haven't quite got through the first division of Isaiah yet, but we'll very quickly take a look at 28 to 35. We already talked about the historical connection, and then we'll be into the last great division of chapters 40 to 66. All right, just quickly to catch the flow of Isaiah 28 to 35. As you remember, and let me just do this so we can superimpose, and you can see where this fits. All right, the first major division of Isaiah, 1:1 is an introduction. Then we have the division that deals with the condemnation. And we have gone through the first section, the first 12 chapters that concentrate upon Jerusalem, Judah, Israel's judgment. And then in chapters 13 to 27, the oracles of the nation's judgment and restoration. And then in chapter 28 to 35, Isaiah does two things. He has a collection of woes that is in chapter 28 to 33. And then in chapters 34 and 35, he calls in chapter 34 for the nations to draw near and listen to the fact that he is going to bring his judgment upon Edom as foundational for his spirit gathering Israel back to the land where they will enjoy the Lord's bounty in the future. Hold that idea of Edom being destroyed so that Israel can be replanted in the land. We'll come back and visit that again in Ezekiel, who is going to actually speak and fill in a few more of those details because as Judah went into captivity, guess who came into the mountains of Judah? Edom. And so as they're speaking in terms of what has taken place and what God will do in the future, it is the fact that they have to be removed for Israel to be established. Now before that, in chapters 28 to 33, we have these woes that are brought before us by Isaiah. Again, he does not give these in any kind, does not link them to any kind of chronological situations. He doesn't tell us exactly when this woe was pronounced. In chapter 28, his emphasis is upon the northern kingdom at the beginning, and then broadens out into Jerusalem, the latter part of the chapter. This basically is, to use Dr. MacArthur's term, woe against drunken politicians. Those who are proud, and their pride comes from their drunken state. How they become braggarts and arrogant under the power of the bottle. And so woe to the proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim, and to the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is at the head of the fertile valley of those who are overcome, those who are smitten with wine. So you proud, arrogant boasters. And in verse 14 broadens it out. Therefore hear the word of the Lord, O scoffers, who rule this people who are in Jerusalem. All right, so now he looks and speaks to the rulers of Jerusalem, who have their own problems with pride and arrogance, and talks about how God is going to bring his judgment upon both Ephraim, the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem and Judah in the south. Then in chapter 29, in verses 1 to 14, Woe, O Ariel, Lion of God, which we can see is Jerusalem, the city where David once camped. And so Jerusalem is brought again by God, confronted by God, because of their formalism in religion. That judgment is going to come upon them because they have not responded to the Lord's word through the prophet. They go through the motions of worshiping the Lord. 29:10, the Lord has poured over you a spirit of deep sleep. He has shut your eyes, the prophets. He has covered your heads, the seers. Those who claim to speak from Yahweh no longer speak from him. And Judah just listens to them instead of listening to Yahweh. There is a further woe in 29:15 through 24. Woe to those who hide their plans from Yahweh. Those who make plans and think that Yahweh doesn't see what they are doing. Well, what plan is taking place? Well, in chapter 30, we see that these are those who execute a plan. Woe to those rebellious children who execute a plan but not mine, who make an alliance but not by my spirit. Verse 2, who proceed down to Egypt without consulting me. What is the secret plan? The secret plan is an alliance with Egypt. And so God, in chapter 30, brings his woe and his coming judgment upon those who would trust in an alliance with Egypt instead of trusting him. He comes back to that in chapter 31. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, trust in chariots and in horsemen, but they do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor do they seek Yahweh. You go down to Egypt because you think Egypt is militarily strong. You're looking for human strength when you should be looking to the Holy One of Israel. So woe to those who turn to Egypt for help, because ultimately God's, as Judah will repent, ultimately what God is going to do in chapter 32 is establish a righteous king in Jerusalem. And in chapter 32, he once again speaks about the coming one that the Lord is going to establish. And then finally, in chapter 33, we have the woe to the destroyer. And this seems to be the Assyrians whom God is going to use to judge Ephraim, to judge Judah in that day. But ultimately, they are going to come under God's judgment as well. And so that leads, as we've already talked about in chapters 34 and 35, where the Lord calls the nations to draw near and hear what he is going to do in reestablishing Israel within the land, as Edom will come under his judgment. So his judgment on Edom, which will lead to Israel's reestablishment. But notice it's very interesting that 34 and 35 go back to the nations. Hear, O nations, hear what I'm going to do concerning Israel. Why? Because what I'm going to do with Israel, has already been seen, is your hope for deliverance in the future as well. And so as Yahweh is at work now in judgment upon the nations, and will be until the final restoration, then why do you, arrogant rulers of Ephraim and Judah, why do you seek alliances with nations when you should trust in Yahweh and trust in Yahweh alone? And then I, don't have a chart for you because we've already talked in the overall chart of Isaiah of where we get into chapters 36 to 39, which historically move us from Assyria to Babylon. So that the focus, as we've seen, of the background of Isaiah's prophecies, they no longer emerge out of the Assyrian crisis of his own day. But by prophecy, he is able to look ahead and see that the one who will conquer Jerusalem and take Judah into captivity will be the Babylonians. And then, as we've already said, in the most amazing 27 chapters of the Old Testament, Isaiah is taken by the Spirit of God and, as it were, is able to speak as though now that exile has historically taken place. So that as we then move to this next section of Isaiah chapter 40 to 66, we see how Isaiah speaks concerning Judah's release from exile. And the division of Isaiah, these last 27 chapters, is broken down into three sections. Section 1 and Section 2 both ending with Isaiah's statement, "There is no peace for the wicked, says Yahweh." That at the end of chapter 48, there is still the wicked among Israel. So there is not yet any peace for the wicked. Same thing when you come to the end of chapter 57. That with all that Isaiah has recounted, there is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. So we still have the wicked. It is only when we come to Isaiah chapter 65 and 66, finally there is peace. Finally, the wicked have been dealt with, have been now cut off from the people. The rebels have been purged out. And finally, Jerusalem is created for rejoicing and will know peace. So it is highly significant, all right, the first 9 chapters, 40 through 48, certainly deal, as Isaiah is speaking, with something that's going to take place. As he speaks to the exiles, he speaks about the fact that God is going to bring them from captivity and allow them to return to their land to rebuild the city and the temple. So to pick it up at the end of chapter 44, verse 26, confirming the word of his servant and performing the purpose of his messengers, it is I who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I will raise up her ruins again. It is I who says to the depths of the sea, be dried up, and will make your rivers dry. It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He will perform all my desire, and he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple your foundation will be laid. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue before kings, to loose the loins of kings before him, to loose the loins of kings, to open the doors before him so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you. I will make the rough places smooth. Verse 4, for the sake of Jacob my servant and Israel my chosen one. Cyrus, I'm going to raise you up. And I'm going to allow you to defeat Babylon, the rivers that will be dried up, so that you are the one who's going to allow my people to go back to the land and rebuild Jerusalem and lay the foundation of the temple. So in the heart of these first 9 chapters, Isaiah makes it clear that what he is speaking about is Jerusalem's deliverance from captivity through Cyrus. And leading up to this is the fact that, all right, God is going to tell us what he's going to do before it happens so that Jacob, Israel, might come to trust in Yahweh, might not trust in idols anymore who are dumb and can't speak, but might truly come to trust in Yahweh and Yahweh himself. And ultimately, judgment comes upon Babylon in chapters 46 and 47, so that Israel can be called to go forth in chapter 48. But Isaiah makes it clear that the physical destruction of Babylon and physically being able to go back to the land is not the final act of God's deliverance, because the wicked are still among them. A physical deliverance is not enough. Therefore, in chapters 49 through 57, Jerusalem needs a far greater deliverance than deliverance from Babylon. They need deliverance from their sin. And in these chapters, in the middle of these chapters, again, the high point of these chapters, as you can see, is in chapter 52:13 to 53:12. Where Isaiah makes it very, very clear whom God is going to use to bring this spiritual deliverance for Israel, the one who will come forth as the guilt offering, who is going to be this servant. And of course, when we start thinking in terms of who is the servant, we come upon the major interpretive issue of these last 27 chapters, and we'll look at that in just a second. But with the suffering servant and the deliverance now this salvation is made available for Israel and for the nations. And yet we find out in 56 and 57 that salvation is not availed of, that even though it was there, Israel continues in her sin. In fact, chapter 53 has already emphasized the fact that this one who will provide redemption is a despised, rejected individual, that Israel will not believe the report concerning him, as he comes. And so again, there is no peace to the wicked. And so Isaiah now brings, to use Motir's term, he now, having spoken about the servant in 49 to 57, now that same servant in 58 to 66 will become the conquering general, what he calls the anointed general, who will come to exercise God's victory first in Israel and then over the nations of the earth, so that in the last couple of chapters, Jerusalem can finally know deliverance and peace that will be the lot when this conquering general returns. Now, as I said, the major interpretive issue that we have to resolve before we can really think our way through these chapters is the issue of who is the servant of Isaiah chapter 40 and following. And you will note, as I have filled in some of the details again from who holds what, you notice that the major commentators all see the fact that there are two servants. The reason for that is so did Isaiah. For as Isaiah speaks of this servant, he speaks of the servant, first of all, being Israel herself. You can just trace along the passages that I've given to you there. Chapter 41, verses 8 and 9. Behold, you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend, whom I have taken from the ends of the earth and called from its remotest parts, and said to you, you are my servant, I have chosen you and not rejected you. And the terminology that is used here, the fact that he has taken them from the remotest parts of the earth, realizes that we're not speaking here of seed singular of Abraham, but seed corporate. This is national Israel. In fact, in chapter 42, he speaks of this servant. Verse 18, 19, hear you deaf and look you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant? Or deaf as my messenger whom I sent? So obviously this is not, if I might put it this way, Yahweh's ideal servant. The servant is blind, the servant is deaf. Now, going back to Isaiah chapter 6, who is deaf and blind to Yahweh as Isaiah gives his message? The nation. All right, keep speaking though they won't hear. They won't see. Their eyes have been blinded. They cannot hear. And in chapter 43, verse 10, you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, in order that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there is no God formed, and there was none after me. So these passages, and you can continue on in 44 and 45, 48, until we get to chapter 49, that Isaiah predominantly within that first division is speaking of the servant being Israel. Israel chosen. Israel called by God to be witnesses to the nations. And yet Israel that has failed in that function because of their rebellion against Yahweh. And from chapters 41 through 48, what he is doing is seeking, as we've already seen in chapter 43:10, to wean Israel from their idolatry, from the fact that they put other gods before Yahweh. And so I am taking you through this judgment, this exile in Babylon, so that you may learn there is no other God but me. The idols are speechless, non-existent, non-entities when it comes to me. I am the only true God. And Israel is blind and deaf and needs to understand that about Yahweh. And so this is the nation Israel. But you come to chapter 49. And all of a sudden you realize that, okay, he's talking about the servant Israel, but now a servant who is distinct from Israel. For a very simple reason. This servant is going to be the means to Israel's redemption. Now it's very interesting that as Isaiah speaks as this servant, his message is to the Gentiles. Listen to me, O islands, and pay attention, you peoples from afar. So as the servant begins to speak, he's not even speaking to Israel. He's speaking to the nations. The Lord called me from the womb. From the body of my mother he named me. He has made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he's concealed me. He has made me a secret arrow. He has hidden me in his quiver. I have been called, but in my growth to maturity I have not been made known. I have been concealed. And he said to me, this one who has been chosen and yet concealed, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will show my glory. Now at that point, having read the first 9 chapters of this message to Israel in exile, all right, as Gentile readers we'd expect when he talks about my servant Israel, we'd expect that he's still talking about whom? The nation. You are my servant Israel, in whom I will show my glory. But I said, now the servant speaks, I have toiled in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Yet surely the justice due to me is with the Lord, and my reward with my God. Now we see in verse 4 this servant saying, whatever I've been chosen to do, my work has been useless. I've spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Nothing has come of it. And yet now, as the prophet speaks for Yahweh, now says Yahweh, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him in order that Israel might be gathered to him. Now the servant, for I am honored in the sight of Yahweh, and my God is my strength. He says, So Yahweh speaks now to the servant. It's too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also make you a light of the nations, so my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Now we see why this is being given to the Gentiles. Because though the servant has come to provide restoration for Israel, Israel has rejected that restoration. And so God says, look, your death, assumed from chapter 53, your work will not be in vain. It will go to the Gentiles. Verse 7, thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel and his Holy One, to the despised one, to the one abhorred by the nation, to the servant of rulers, kings shall see and arise, princes also bow down, because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you. Okay, now to summarize what the servant has said and what Yahweh has said to the servants is, okay, even though you have been despised and abhorred by the nation that is Israel/Judah, there are going to be kings and princes. From whom? Well, can't be from Israel. Within this context, the Gentiles, who will arise and bow down, who will respond to you, because the Lord is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, who chose you. I am going to take what you have done for Israel that they have rejected and make it a blessing to the Gentiles. He comes back and will refer again to the servant in chapter 50 and again, obviously, in 52 and 53. And once we see that there is this servant whom the Lord will send for the nation, distinct from the nation, we can actually go back and see in chapter 42, verses 1 through 4, that even before chapter 49, this servant has already been introduced to us. Now, the majority position of Orthodox evangelical exegetes, as you can see, is that yes, even though, in fact, the majority of the term servant as used in chapters 40 through 53 refer to the nation Israel, that's certainly based upon chapter 49, verses 5 and 6. We have to make a distinction between the nation Israel and an individual whom God is going to send. Now, later on, it is true that servant, plural, servants will be seen in chapters 54 through 66. That within the context will definitely be seen as the righteous remnant of Israel. But that is not servant singular, that is servant plural. Because the Exposed Bible Commentary says, well, servant can be used in three ways in these chapters. And it's very true, it can. But in the singular, it doesn't refer to the righteous remnant. It refers to either the nation or the individual. Some of the liberals bring out that, okay, the individual is the prophet Isaiah himself. Because remember chapter 6, Isaiah was going to suffer to take the message to the people. He was going to have a hard time. He's sent by Yahweh. He's chosen instrument of Yahweh to the nation. So it's the prophet. Yeah, and the prophet gave up his life as a guilt offering for his people. And this doesn't fit when you get to chapter 53 or even before that. And so, of course, and as all of the commentators will bring up, for those of us who've read the New Testament, although by reading the Old Testament itself we can come to see this, that this is the coming Messiah, the new Moses. And I slash because a couple of the commentators, rather than talking about the new Moses, talk about the ideal Israel. In fact, Motir uses the fact that it is the ideal Israel, that is the ultimate Moses, the ultimate David. And that's covering all your bases as a commentator. All right, this one who is coming is the Messiah, who is the anticipatory individual that has been seen previously in Isaiah and in the previous books of the Old Testament, the Torah, and the former prophets. And you can see how the commentators, and rightfully so, all hold that position. So who is the servant? In Isaiah 40 to 53. Well, predominantly in the first 9 chapters, the servant is Israel, the nation. And yet a nation that has failed God and still fails him by not responding to the deliverance that he has brought through Cyrus. The majority will not go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The wicked are still among them. They will not respond to Isaiah's message to come out of Babylon and leave. This shows the underlying sin that continues in Israel, so that God in the future will send, yes, an Israel, a true Israel, an ideal Israel, who will be the Messiah, who will pay the penalty for his people's sin. A payment that is rejected by the nation and so extended to the Gentiles. Until finally, in the last third section of Isaiah, finally Israel will repent, come to their senses, and there will be servants of Yahweh, the righteous remnant, that God will deliver and rule over, and finally God's kingdom will be established. Now, and I have to answer this, and then we're done till Friday. People will look at that and say, you've read the New Testament. Well, I plead guilty. So do you. We've read the New Testament. But I submit to you that without the New Testament, just taking Isaiah for Isaiah, as he speaks to Israel in exile and traces it through, from Babylon to the new rejoicing Jerusalem. These are the 3 steps that he takes. All right? Release from Babylon, the coming servant who will die but be rejected, salvation go to the Gentiles, until finally Israel responds in repentance. And that one, the suffering servant, returns as the conquering general to establish the new Jerusalem, where the wicked will be cast out and righteousness will dwell. Well, think on these things. We'll come back and look at these chapters more precisely on Friday, the first part, and we will deal with that sticky interpretive issue of the new heavens and new earth in Isaiah.